I like big books and I cannot lie. Today I'm going to be talking about the top 10 longest books that I have read. They might not be the ones that you would expect to see given my taste in books, but I'm here to talk about them, and of course to keep this video more interesting, I'm only going to allow one book per series because without that I think this video would be a little bit boring based off of a few of my picks. I'd love to have your guess down below in the comments before we get started. What book do you expect to see? And all that being said, let's get started. Now I'm going to rank this video going from the smallest big book to the biggest big book, which sounds ridiculous to say on camera, but essentially creating a little bit of suspense as you can try to guess what is coming in this video. The first one at number 10 is Speaking Bones by Ken Liu, which is the third book in the Dandelion Dynasty Quartet. I actually looked at my copies and it looked as if Wall of Storms was actually going to be larger, but when I checked Goodreads it told me this one, and sure enough it seems like they just used thinner pages in the later two books, and this one certainly was a chunky book. I've talked about this series multiple times on my channel. It is a fantasy story inspired by Chinese history, but very much weaving its own. It's a multi-POV, it's rich, it's dense. It's one of my favorites, so I talk about this all the time, so I'll really try to keep it brief here, but very much worth your time. The first two books particularly are favorites of mine, and if you're going to read this series, read it the whole way through. I believe it was originally planned to be a trilogy, but the second half of the series was just so large that they had to break it up, because even as a 4-book quartet, again, this is one of the largest books I've read. Then at number 9, we have A Dance with Dragons, the 5th book in A Song of Ice and Fire. Everyone knows about this epic fantasy series, so I'll skip over the synopsis and instead mention that I feel like this series, or particularly this book, shows up in all of these longest book videos that I watch, just because again it's such a popular series, and this one is consistently, regardless of what volume or format you're looking at, tends to be the longest one. Well worth your time. Love this series. Do not mind how long it is. I just want it to be finished, and we all know how we feel about that. Next up we have Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson, which is a hard book to summarize. It involves spies and code breakers and cryptocurrency, and it's just this crazy epic adventure that could only be conceived through the mind of this brilliant author who loves to share his knowledge and his expertise through the page, and this one is very much a chunky one. This particular copy is a mass market paperback, so I recognize that does affect the page length, but regardless of what edition you're getting, it's definitely up there in length. And it is not a short book to read, and I do think it's worth your time. I love it. It's not my personal all-time favorite of his, but it has made my favorites of the year lists in the past, because I think that it is very much the kind of book that I love from him when, again, he is what I want to say info dumping, but I don't mean that in a negative way, sharing his knowledge with all of us in a way that is kooky and strange and offbeat and quirky. I love all of it, and again, not perhaps for everyone, maybe not a blanket recommendation for everyone looking to get into science fiction and these thriller type books, but very much up my alley. Definitely recommend this one. It's not a short one, but I had so much fun with it. Then at number 8, we have Shogun by James Clavell. This, of course, is a piece of epic historical fiction that is all centered around feudal Japan. If you follow my channel, you'll know that historical fiction is not one of the genres that I typically pick up and read frequently. However, this is one that really caught my attention given my love of epic fantasy. Getting to read such an epic story, and particularly with the Japanese focus and cultural elements to it really piqued my interest and completely delivered. This one is super buzzy. I read this one when the TV show was coming out. I still haven't watched the TV show, but I have read the book, which is fantastic. Really just, again, this incredible experience, well worth the time. And again, even if you're someone like me who doesn't regularly read historical fiction, definitely give this one a try. Don't get swayed by the page length. It is completely worth it and you will fly through. Next up, we have Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson, the 3rd book in the Stormlight Archive series. Another book that, yes, requires no introduction. Everyone's familiar with it. You'll definitely notice that there is a lot more fantasy in this video here, given the fact that fantasy, more than perhaps science fiction and other genres I read, leans towards these big, epic tomes, and that's very much the case here. In my opinion, this one could have been edited a touchdown. I flew through these books quite quickly. I found the writing to be very easily and accessible, which I think is what Brandon Sanderson does best. Certainly whether or not you continue on with the series really just depends on how you feel about Brandon Sanderson and this particular epic adventure. I personally was able to fly through them very quickly, so that wasn't so much of an issue for me, but don't get me wrong, they're big books. Even when I first got these, I thought, oh my goodness, what am I getting myself into? These books are huge. So take it for what you will. You're probably already read these books. If you're a big fan of fantasy, it's kind of one of those must-read books that gets on everyone's list. Next is The Count of Monte Cristo, this classic story of revenge, one that I've touched on briefly on my channel. I think I've mentioned in previous videos, but I often say that I don't read a lot of classics. I'm perhaps more drawn to modern fiction prose, and so often I'm quite intimidated by the classics, and even more so intimidated by a classic that is this long. But I did take the opportunity to read it. I really set a goal a couple years back to read the biggest books on my TBR, to read the biggest books on my shelves, in my library, etc. And I'm so glad I did, because this is a fantastic story that, again, is great for those of you like myself that don't read as many classics. Despite the length, the book itself is easy to follow. I think it deals with some very classic tropes, again, of revenge that really transcend the years and just feel as prevalent and important to talk about today as it did at the time. It makes sense, it's easy to follow, you understand the characters' motivations, and you get, again, this epic tale full of twists and turns and beautiful writing. Despite the length, it's just always impressive to see an author who can write that many pages and keep the level of quality up so high. So again, I think it's a book that's probably on a lot of people's list to read, but not as many people as I personally know have read it, just because it's always that book we put off till later. But let this video be your sign that this is the year you read Monte Cristo. It is so worth it, such a good read. I want to read it again despite the length. It's a commitment, but again, a commitment that's completely worth it. Next, we have the science fiction novel Limit, which is a standalone piece that is set in a future, or a future at that point in time, 2025, where we have developed a space elevator. And so it deals with this future enterprise, this hotel in space, and very much all the business that ensues. This is a book that is interesting. It's, again, the same author who wrote The Swarm, which is a book I adore. And this book is longer, so I am including this one here. However, I will say that while it is a good book, I think I gave it 4 stars. In my mind, it didn't have to be this long. I'm shocked looking back that it actually is longer than some of the books I just mentioned. And while, again, I think it's a perfectly good science fiction book, when I compare it to other perfectly good science fiction books that are hundreds of pages less, I am somewhat reluctant to recommend this one, especially to anyone who has limits in their free time, are perhaps a slower reader, and are looking to get through a certain number of books per year. I just don't think it's amazing enough to justify the length of time that you'll have to spend with the book, depending on your reading speed. I liked it, but it definitely was a letdown given the fact that I went into this book loving The Swarm and hoping to have the same quality, which, again, if The Swarm was this long, I would have no problem with that. The Swarm is already a chunky book, and I flew through it because it was so amazing. This one is just fine, which is a hard thing to say about a book that is, again, over 1,000 pages. Next, we have The Fiery Cross by Diana Gabaldon. This is a story that is a piece of historical fiction with elements of time travel and romance within it. It's very much a multi-genre story that, of course, I think most people are at least aware of the first book. This is the 5th and really continues on the story of this woman, this nurse, who ends up going back in time to Scotland. She meets a man, they fall in love, and she has to survive in the past and try to figure out if she can get home or make a life here. This is a series I've generally loved, but I do admit that it's one that I didn't actually binge just because each of the books is so long, and while I love each of the books as I read them, I tend to need breaks in between them, which is not something I normally need. Normally, if I'm enjoying a series, I just continue to binge through, but these books really do fatigue me. By the time I'm done, I go to start the next book and realize that I need a little bit of space, and so that is how I've consumed this series over the years. And certainly, Fiery Cross was a good one, had a good time with it. Again, your mileage may vary. Some people hate the series, some people love it. I lean much more on the enjoyment side, otherwise I wouldn't have invested so much time reading it. And if you love it, I'd love to know your opinions down below. If you don't, feel free to chime in too. Then at number 2, we have It by Stephen King. This, of course, is his chunky, epic horror masterpiece following this town of Derry, where we have these children who are fighting against the evil of the town. They come back as adults to fight it once again. This is a story that I have a whole history with. I read it the first time when I was first getting into horror, didn't know what I was getting myself into, ended up hating it and having a really emotional response to it. Especially that last scene. I've since then reread it. I did a vlog when I did that, and I've come to appreciate it so much more. It certainly is a case where you need to know what you're getting yourself into, know and set your expectations accordingly, because if you're looking for a certain type of story and not understanding what kind of horror Stephen King writes, and really that was my problem from the start. So it was a story that did not feel like it was worth my time the first time, and I really should have just DNF'd it or put it down. And I think often when I have a lot of emotion emotional feelings about a story in a negative way, it's because I pushed through a long book when I should have moved on to something else. Having reread it, now I can say it is worth my time. It is one that I plan to reread. I think it has some great things in it. I've really come to appreciate it, and of course all of the cultural references that have followed after, all the inspiration I see in all the books and movies that I consume these days. And so if you are the target audience, I very much think it's worth your time, but know what you're getting yourself into, do your research, know what Stephen King does in his stories, understand his methodology, and if you go in with the right expectations, you will have a great time with this one. At least I hope. Other than that scene. That one scene is weird. I will stand by the fact that I don't love that one scene, but you all know what I'm talking about. And finally, the longest book I have read as of currently, this will change over time of course, is The Last Light, the 5th book in the Wandering In series by Pirate Abba. This is a series that I talked about on my channel before. It is a web serial that was turned into more traditional novels, both as ebooks and also audiobooks. It is one that I consumed up to a point in time, and I've somewhat paused the series largely because of my fatigue. I have done a whole series review, so I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds here because that will be coming soon on my channel. But it is a series that your mileage may vary. If you love the first book, love the second, of course, keep going. It is one that you can binge through, and in terms of having a lot of content to consume for a relatively cheap price, if that is something that you consider in kind of that metric and calculation when you're planning out your reading, that can be fantastic depending on what you're looking for in a book and what you find to be quality writing and storytelling. Alternatively, if you're someone who has certain expectations in terms of writing quality and narrative style, it might not be for you. And again, you'll know that well before you get to book 5 and the later books into the series. This is very much a case of a series where your mileage may vary depending on what you're looking for in a story. I think in terms of the calculation of your time and money, you can get a lot of bang for your buck whether you're doing the ebooks or the audios in the case of this one here. Personally, given my taste, I wish the series had been more edited down. While I think it is worth reading for a certain type of reader, my preference certainly would be to have it be slimmer and a more tightly written story. I don't think it needs to be on the top of this longest book list compared to some of the other books that hit those same page counts. It doesn't have the quality compared to certain other books I'm mentioning and comparing it to, but is it one of the longest book series I've ever read? Absolutely. It is not one of the longest, it is the longest, and it will probably keep that trophy for possibly the rest of my reading life. I can't imagine anything else having a longer page count than this series. And that book alone, The Last Light, is a really tough one to beat. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on reading for yourself, and also love to know what are some of the longest books you've ever read, how do they compare, and specifically of those long books, were they worth your time? Because I think that's part of the equation when it comes to these videos. Hopefully you didn't mind this video as a bit of a diversion from my usual content. It just has been a really busy week here. Work honestly is kicking my butt, and so this video allowed me to talk about some books without having to read a lot in a week when I'm really incredibly busy. Hope you all are doing well. Don't forget, like, subscribe, hit that little notification bell, all those good things, and I will hopefully talk to you again soon. Okay, bye.